Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am profoundly grateful to Dr. Rupa Ben Shah, Dr. Nandita Shah, and the other stalwarts of the whole food plant-based diet movement who have provided me the honor of this esteemed days. I am Dr. Sanjeev Khanna, a medical gastroenterologist at Mumbai. I consult at the Holy Spirit Criticare and the Max Nanavati Hospital. In addition, I practice at my own clinic at Andheri, a western suburb of Mumbai, since the last 37 years. Our talk today centers on a molecule which is so vital for human health that survival without it is either means being terribly miserable or well nigh impossible. This molecule, ladies and gentlemen, is called vitamin B12. Now, what is a vitamin? The word vitamin was suggested by a scientist, Max Nierenstein, to his Polish friend, Casimir Funk, who was a biochemist at Bristol way back in 1912. He called it vitamin to mean vital amine. Especially this was in relation to vitamin B1 or thiamine. Later on, although it was found that not all vitamins were amines, the name got so well entrenched that it stuck. And there we are with the name. Vitamins are organic molecules that are essential for an organism for its metabolism. Now, what is metabolism? Metabolism is a set of life-sustaining chemical reactions to, one, convert food to energy, two, make building blocks for the body, that is protein, fat, carbohydrate being converted to body tissues and being absorbed and specially utilized by the liver to synthesize new molecules for the body's use. And lastly, third, to eliminate toxic wastes or metabolic wastes. Now, where do the vitamins come in? There are 13 vitamins, starting with vitamin A, then the vitamin B complex, which consists of 8 different molecules in all, vitamin C, D, E, and K. Vitamins have diverse biochemical functions. They function as enzyme cofactors or as their precursors. I will dwell upon this in a little brief later on. Don't get confused by these terminologies. They're all very simple, and I will explain them to you. All vitamins were discovered between the years 1912 and 1948. The first tablets of vitamin B complex were made from yeast extract, and they were made as recently as 1935. Mass production of multivitamins began in 1950. Vitamins have an interesting history. The value of certain foods to prevent illness was well known since many centuries. These were specially discovered during the long ocean voyages and obviously started when ships could travel for long distances and be out at sea for many months. The lack of storage facilities for fruit and vegetables led to classic deficiency diseases in the sailors. In 1747, for example, the Scottish surgeon James Lind found that citrus fruits prevented scurvy. Scurvy caused bleeding gums, poor wound healing, and death in sailors. And this could be simply prevented by adding lime or lemons to the diet, which was then adopted by the British Royal Navy. This led to the nickname of limey for British sailors. Similarly, the discovery of polished white rice causing vitamin B1 or thiamine deficiency, or what was called beriberi, was discovered in 1884 by a Japanese naval doctor, Takaki Kanehiro. Vitamin B12, my area of interest, was discovered in 1948 and generated 5 Nobel Awards after that in subsequent years. It is called cobalamin, and it is required by humans as a cofactor in making the very vital DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, which is part and parcel of every cell's nucleus. It is also, B12 is also required for fatty acid and amino acid metabolism. Via these functions, it plays an absolutely essential role in making an insulating fatty sheath on the body's nerves. And this is called myelin. This helps in conducting nerve impulses at a fast speed. Maturation of the red blood cells in the bone marrow is also its other prime function. B12 is the most chemically complex of all vitamins. Traditional teaching in all schools, even in the general science books of secondary schools, colleges, and in all hallowed medical texts, says that B12 can be found only in animal-derived foods. That means meat, poultry, fish, eggs, or milk. Deficiency can lead to very common symptoms of fatigue, or what we call TATT, or tired all the time, weakness, tingling numbness of the hands and feet. Something new which I read called BUHS, or the bilateral useless hand syndrome. Lightheadedness, shortness of breath, inability to walk, diarrhea, loss of memory or brain fog as it is called, anemia, faintness, psychosis, erectile dysfunction, and decreased fertility. The medical terms for all this are megaloblastic anemia, peripheral neuropathy, subacute combined degeneration of the cord, spinal cord, dementia, and even death. In children, developmental delays can occur. B12 is a red-colored substance and contains the element called cobalt as part of its structure, and hence the name cobalamine. One's daily needs are small, just about 2.4 micrograms, but it is hard to come by in foods, and especially for vegetarians and more so for vegans. It's a very prized commodity. Absorption is just at 50% of the ingested amount. And to top it all, it is not made by plants or animals, and only certain bacteria can produce it. B12 also incidentally plays a very important part in regulating the level of serotonin. And serotonin, maintains one's euphoric state, and hence the connection to depression and mood. Increased incidence of heart attacks, strokes can occur in B12 deficiency. B12 is synthesized by human gut microbes. You know that we are a walking, talking busload of organisms. The DNA of bacteria in our body, or the total microbiome, is almost 10 times more than our own DNA. So we are nothing but a huge colony of bacteria living in almost every tissue of ours. The problem is that the synthesis of B12 in the human body occurs in the colon. That means the large intestine. And that is beyond the small bowel, where it could have been absorbed. Absorption occurs in the small intestine. Many animals, such as cows and sheep, make it from microbes in their foregut, in their upper gut, and hence are able to absorb it. There are other animals like rabbits, deer, and the great apes, to which species we incidentally belong. And these can synthesize it only in their hindgut. Now, the animals obtain their B12 by ingesting their own fecal matter, what is called coprophagy. Modern humans obviously will not find this very palatable or appealing. For the animal's gut bacteria to produce B12, it should consume cobalt. And therefore, soil which is for some reason not having enough cobalt may not give the animal or the livestock enough B12, and may be one of the reasons why B12 deficiency can occur even in non-vegetarians. The B12 in the animal gets stored in their livers and muscle, in their eggs and milk, and these therefore act as sources for human B12. There are certain species of algae and spirulina and other cyanobacteria which produce what is called a pseudo vitamin B12. And this is not very biologically active. And according to some researchers, it may even inhibit the absorption of B12. You can see here that the salivary glands produce a substance called haptocorin. This, or it's also called transcobalamin 1. This is released during mastication and then enters the stomach. In the stomach, the B12, which is bound to protein, is released from protein by the action of an enzyme called pepsin. The pepsin is produced by certain cells in the stomach. Also, there is a very important cell called the parietal cell, which produces two substances, hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. These are vital to the absorption of cobalamin. The cobalamin or B12 and haptocorin enter the duodenum. In the duodenum, they are subjected to action from pancreatic juices and proteases from the pancreas. They release the haptocorin and the B12 then gets bound to intrinsic factor, which is a glycoprotein. The B12 or cobalamin is chaperoned into the distal ileum by the intrinsic factor. In the distal ileum, there are receptors on the cells for cobalamin, which then help it to get absorbed and transported in the blood by a transporter enzyme, by a transporter substance called transcobalamin 2. The liver is the main storage site for B12 and can store B12 for a period of 3 to 5 years. And therefore, deficiency of B12 will not occur even if absorption is stopped up to a period of 3 years. So you can understand that when a patient comes to you with a low B12 level, he has been deficient in the absorption of B12 for years. Now, B12 and folate are critical for making DNA and RNA. You know that these are part and parcel of every cell's nucleus. B12, you can see, is required as a cofactor for the action of an enzyme called methionine synthase. This is a type of a form of folic acid, which is also vitamin B9, which gets converted to a substance called THF or tetrahydrofolate, which is extremely important in making purines and pyrimidines, which are the basis of or the building blocks or nucleotides for nucleic acids. Simultaneously, a substance called homocysteine gets converted to another amino acid called methionine. This requires the use of an enzyme called methionine synthase, which works only under the effect of cobalamin. So you can understand the importance of vitamin B12 to both these reactions. Also, cobalamin enters into the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, and takes part in the most important energy giving reaction, which or cycle, which is called the Krebs cycle. And in that, a substance called methylmalonyl coenzyme A is converted to succinyl coenzyme A under the action of another enzyme called methylmalonyl mutase. And this again requires B12 for its completion. So you can see that B12 is absolutely vital to various chemical reactions, which then produce, which are required for the basic production of cells, and especially the fast dividing tissues, especially the bone marrow. So the formation of red blood cells, white blood cells, and other factors in the bone marrow is totally dependent on proper action of B12 and to a certain extent folate. Also, B12 is required for lipid synthesis. And if B12 is not adequate, then methylmalonyl coenzyme A will accumulate in the body. And that and homocysteine both together cause myelin damage. Also, homocysteine causes vascular damage, and high levels of homocysteine are found in patients who have premature strokes or premature coronary artery disease. B12 is especially needed for DNA synthesis by cells called oligodendrocytes, and therefore the synthesis of this very important insulating cover on the nerves is possible only due to the action of B12. So you can see, ladies and gentlemen, that as B12 is involved in so many essential pathways, its deficiency produces tremendous health problems. And I told you, increased homocysteine, which we measure in the lab very easily, may play a role in cognitive decline, in dementia, even in Alzheimer's disease, and the increasing incidence of cerebrovascular disease or paralytic attacks and strokes and heart attacks or coronary artery disease. Ladies and gentlemen, and now addressing the core issue of our talk. What leads to this deficiency of this absolutely essential vitamin? Let us begin at the beginning, as they say. Since the last about 12 years or so, I started doing vitamin B12 levels routinely in most of my patients. And this was part of regular screening. I was rather surprised and intrigued to see low levels of B12 even in hardcore non-vegetarian populations. This I noted in hundreds of patients who were otherwise had no reason to have, a B12 deficiency. Now, this was contrary to standard textbook teaching in all the hallowed medical texts. The most widely read Harrison's Principle of Internal Medicine, which is read by almost every medical graduate and postgraduate worth his or her salt, says in its 20th edition to 2018, the only source of B12 for humans is food of animal origin. It goes on to mention that vegetables and other foods of non-animal origin are free from cobalamin unless contaminated by bacteria. I really commend the author for writing this very bold statement and very true statement. This thought led me to investigate my obsession. That was this whole concept of non-vegetarianism and B12 sufficiency flawed to some extent. This thought, ladies and gentlemen, became more than an obsession. It became my passion. And it led to an investigative study, which I shall very briefly outline. Along with a small dedicated group of young medicos, we did serum B12 levels on a little more than 100 third and fourth year medical students from a nearby medical school. There were 50 students in each group, vegetarian and non-vegetarians. The students had no illness. They were on no medication since the last 6 months. They were young men and women in the age group of 18 to 21 and were otherwise healthy. Rather unsurprisingly for me, the results showed no statistical difference in the B12 levels in both groups. We had a qualified registered dietitian who went into the dietary patterns of both groups in detail. And the results were in keeping with my observation over the last so many years in my office practice. Was the entire concept of B12 being found only in animal origin foods a myth? Now that I look at it dispassionately, I think there is more to it that meets the eye. We can see that I showed you in the previous diagram that a lot of diseases can affect B12 absorption, and a lot of our lifestyle factors can affect B12 absorption. My observations and thought on this enigma are here. Though we will obviously need more studies to substantiate certain of my thoughts, which are at the moment hypotheses. The first one, our obsession with time and power lunches has led to meals being taken on the run, poorly chewed, gobbled while multitasking, while looking at computer screens, while talking on the phone. Is salivary haptocorrin being allowed to do its job? Just a thought. However, I found no robust data or literature on this, and I think it's worth a detailed study. The second important thing, overuse of clean water and food, leading to almost sterile food intakes, which substantiates Harrison's statement that unless there are bacteria in the food, we will not get B12. I'm absolutely certain in my heart that this plays a part. Just like the hygiene hypothesis is being shown to be important for inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, which is now becoming a scourge in India. A few decades ago, when I was a medical student, the first line one was supposed to write in an answer on ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease was that this disease is distinctly uncommon in our country. I can say that the reverse is true now. One sees new cases almost on a daily basis. No major B12 deficiencies were reported in the past. However, to be truthful in that respect, one will have to say that we never did B12 assays so commonly. The third important thing, overuse and abuse of antibiotics, antacids, and the widespread use of metformin, not just for diabetes, where it is the cornerstone of treatment, but even for other things like weight loss and even being touted as an anti-aging drug. All this leads to decreased hydrochloric acid in the stomach. This leads to poor separation of B12 from food. Pepsin, which I told you, which is the protein breakdown enzyme, requires hydrochloric acid for its action to be converted from its precursor form of pepsinogen to pepsin, and which will then act on the protein. This leads to decreased availability of the B12 at the distal ileum where it has to be absorbed. Proton pump inhibitors are becoming like a most widely prescribed drug, and almost every hospital based patient's prescription will contain a PPI. Unfortunately, it's available as an OTC product in our country, and a lot of patients will buy it off the counter and use it, not knowing what they're doing to their own biochemistry and to the chemistry of their stomach. B12 deficiency will occur with prolonged proton pump inhibitor or H2 receptor blocker use. You know of drugs like omeprazole, pantoprazole, esomeprazole, the whole lot is available. And H2 blockers like famotidine, ranitidine, and the over-the-counter, very easily available antacids. They all cause a problem. The next important thing, Helicobacter infection, which in some way affects hydrochloric acid formation by damaging the lining of the stomach and producing what is called atrophic gastritis. There are innumerable papers in peer-reviewed journals on this, of the association between Helicobacter and B12 deficiency. However, data at this stage is uncertain to use Helicobacter treatment as a treatment for bringing up B12 levels. Also, both H. pylori infection and B12 deficiency have a very high prevalence. According to certain papers, our deficiency percentage is almost 47%. In the group we studied, it was even higher, going into the 70s. Also, B12 deficiency is common, and so is Helicobacter infection common. So are we having a fortuitous combination of two common entities? And we know the old saying that association is not equal to causation. So one will have to study this in more detail to find out. And the proof of the pudding will be that if eradication of B12 of Helicobacter consistently raises B12 levels, then we have something to talk about. There are also the other infection which can occur in the upper GI tract, which is again common in our country, is giardiasis. And Giardia lamblia and its role in B12 deficiency are well defined. Giardia lamblia is rampant in some of our populations. The next is distal ileal disease. The last part of the small intestine is prone specifically to certain diseases like tuberculosis, which is again common in our country, and Crohn's disease, which is now becoming common. So that last part of the ileum somehow is prone to these diseases, possibly because of the high amount of lymphoid tissue there and the stasis of the intestinal contents which occurs at that part. And that leads to the very target area for B12 absorption getting affected. So that also can explain. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is a very well recognized cause for malabsorption, and that is now becoming very, very common. And that also possibly contributes to our low B12 levels. Celiac disease, which again we are in certain states, especially in the north of India, we are almost matching Europeans' prevalence rates, is now becoming very common. And celiac, we know, will lead to a malabsorption all the way in the GI tract, right from the duodenum downwards, especially. And these are the areas where I explained to you how B12 gets absorbed and how it gets affected. Pernicious anemia is a rare autoimmune disease where there are antibodies formed against the parietal cell, which makes hydrochloric acid an intrinsic factor. And there are antibodies also against the intrinsic factor. Fortunately, it is still rare in our country. The other important source, which I'm sure, these are the things which I feel are all important in the low B12 levels we find in our population. The other very important and oft not given so much importance is possibly the use of reverse osmosis and this very high grade water filters. Water filters are ubiquitous in use. They were there in our study group also. Almost every family uses a water filter for fear of picking up waterborne diseases. But the recommendation is that water should have at least 150 milligrams of what is called TDS in a certain volume of water. Now, if TDS means total dissolved solutes, if this falls below a certain level, then the likelihood of this water having deleterious effects on health goes up. And this has again been shown in many papers, many research papers. So possibly the overuse of water filters with this very high purifying capacity is also contributing to B12 deficiency across the board. Now, how can vegetarians and vegans, which are our main group to whom we would like to address this, get their B12? Unfortunately, there are not too many sources, but some of the sources which have been studied and found to be useful are shiitake mushrooms, fermented foods like sauerkraut, pickles in our country, kanji, which is a fermented drink made out of carrots, especially in the north of India, and the exotic dishes of tempeh and kimchi. And these can be consumed by vegetarians. There is a researcher from Andhra Pradesh, Dr. Wali, who has done work on what he calls is a millet combo called Sri Dhanya, and has shown that it raises B12 levels. And finally, of course, nothing stops vegans and vegetarians from using a B12 tablet. It's a very simple and very easy way of getting our B12 into us, as opposed to our coprophagic cousins like the gorilla. Organic manure, especially made from cow manure, has been shown in a paper to significantly increase the content of B12 in spinach leaves. Hence, to summarize, ladies and gentlemen, the deficiency of B12 is multifactorial. Diet is just one cog, though an important one, in the wheel of B12 deficiency. Vegetarians and even vegans need not despair. If the dietary sources I've alluded to are insufficient, a small oral supplement is all that is required. My proposition, ladies and gentlemen, is therefore that possibly the B12 and non-vegetarian connection is just one peg in the giant wheel of wellness which this magical molecule creates. The connection has obviously been hyped over the centuries by the powers that be and possibly by vested interests. It is time to put such misinformation in its proper perspective. Mahatma Gandhi once said that silence becomes cowardice when the occasion demands speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, let's break the silence. Let's deliver this novel idea to the present generation. Let's confront the vested interests and deeply entrenched status quoism of industry, politics, and culture. Let the whole food, plant-based professionals be the beacon on the hill to topple preposterous, long-held, and erroneous beliefs which need to be debunked of their arrogance and thrown by the wayside. Let's bring the world of ahimsa, which our Upanishads gave to the world more than 3,000 years ago, where non-violence to one and all, in thought, word, and deed, is the force of truth. And just to cite a small example, it needs almost 50,000 liters of water to make 1 kilo of beef. Think of the economic, ecological havoc that meat brings about. With more than 60 crore vegetarians and vegans in the world, this is certainly an achievable proposition. And to quote one of my heroes, Phil Wallen, if we all ate a Western diet, we would soon need 2 earths to feed us. We have only one, and she is dying. Also from Phil Wallen, the earth can produce enough food for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. And to quote Victor Hugo, there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And as a corollary, there is nothing more destructive than an idea whose time has passed. Ladies and gentlemen, the time for meat has passed. Good night and best wishes to the new dawn. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.